Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a damp and sullen evening in late November that I found myself once again ensconced within the familiar walls of 221B Baker Street. A thick yellow fog clung to the windows, casting the world beyond in a dim, unearthly gloom. The fire crackled in the grate, sending out intermittent pops that broke the silence like distant pistol shots. Holmes sat languidly in his armchair, his long pale fingers cradling the neck of his violin, from which he drew forth slow, melancholic strains that matched the melancholy of the hour. He had been in this mood for much of the afternoon, neither speaking nor moving beyond the gentle sway of his bow. I had long since learned not to intrude upon him during these periods of introspection, for they often mark the germination of some complex mental process, the full flower of which would be revealed only when the time was ripe. "I observe," I ventured at last, "that your mind is far from idle this evening." He gave no answer, but only altered the melody, shifting it into a minor key that carried a distinctly sinister undertone. It was at that precise moment that a sudden rapping at the door jarred the stillness. Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps were followed by her voice in the hallway. "A gentleman from the French embassy, Mr. Holmes. He insists upon seeing you at once." Holmes placed the violin aside and leaned forward. "Show him in," he said. "I believe the fog has brought with it something of interest, Watson." The man who entered was of medium height, immaculately dressed, yet evidently perturbed. His fine features were flushed, and his gloved hands trembled as he removed his hat. There was a faint sheen of perspiration upon his brow, despite the chill outside. He bowed quickly, first to Holmes and then to me, before speaking in a voice coloured with a marked Parisian accent. "Monsieur Holmes, I am Jacques Vernet, attaché to the French embassy. I apologize for the intrusion, but I have come on a matter of grave urgency." Holmes motioned to the armchair opposite him. "Please, Mr. Vernet, you have chosen wisely to come tonight, for my mind is in want of occupation. Begin at once." Vernet seated himself, though not without evident restlessness. "It concerns one of our senior diplomats, Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Drouet. He has vanished, monsieur, utterly and inexplicably. 3 nights ago, he retired to his private residence in Belgravia. He was expected at a diplomatic breakfast the next morning and failed to appear. The staff found his bedroom locked from within, and yet he was gone." Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest, though he said nothing. "The police have been involved, of course," Vernet continued, "but they find no sign of foul play. No one saw him leave, and there is no second exit from the room. The windows were latched. There was no broken glass, no forced entry, nothing." "And the man himself?" Holmes asked, steepling his fingers. "He is a patriot, monsieur. And more than that, he was entrusted with documents vital to the Anglo-French naval accords." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The air in the room had shifted palpably. A mere disappearance was one thing. A diplomat with state secrets. That was another matter entirely. Vernet leaned forward, his voice low and urgent, as though the very walls might betray him. "Monsieur Drouet maintained a suite on the second floor of a private house in Eaton Place, secured for him by the embassy. He returned home shortly after 8 in the evening, attended only by his valet. He retired to his study, as was his custom, and requested not to be disturbed. The door was closed and locked from the inside. The windows were shuttered and secured. No one entered or left, and yet, by morning, he was gone. Holmes tilted his head. What time was his absence discovered? Shortly before 9. The housekeeper knocked and received no answer. When the valet attempted the door, it remained locked. A locksmith was summoned. When they finally forced entry, there was no one. No sign of a struggle. None. The chair he had last occupied was pushed back, as though he had risen abruptly. His overcoat and scarf remained. His personal papers, undisturbed. Even his watch and pocketbook were upon the writing table. Holmes's brow furrowed. And the embassy's confidential documents? Vernet gave a sharp nod. Gone, along with the man. Watson, ever the realist, asked, might he have absconded willingly? Never, Vernet said with sudden force. Jean-Baptiste was a man of impeccable service, utterly devoted to France. Besides, he had no enemies in England, no reason to disappear. It is as though the earth swallowed him whole. I caught Holmes's expression, alert, intense, the faintest trace of a smile upon his lips. He rose and walked to the fireplace, tapping his fingers along the mantelpiece in measured thought. A locked room, he murmured. A vanished man, missing papers, and no witness to any act. Curious indeed. He turned back to our visitor. Tell me, Mr. Vernet, what precisely was found in the room? Vernet hesitated. Very little, monsieur. Yet what we found was peculiar. Holmes gestured for him to go on. On the hearth there was a petal, singed at the edges. A rose, though of a type I have not seen in England. The air bore a faint scent of absinthe, unmistakable. And upon the panelling above the fireplace, someone, somehow, had scorched a strange mark into the wood. Not a word or letter, but a symbol. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Describe it. It resembled an eye, encircled by a triangle, with what might have been rays or flames radiating outward. The police took it for some decorative blemish. Fools, Holmes muttered. And you say the room was undisturbed otherwise? Entirely. It was as though he had vanished into smoke. Holmes folded his arms. No man vanishes, not truly. But there are means of illusion, some mechanical, others psychological. He turned to me. Watson, I believe we must pay a visit to Eaton Place tomorrow morning. There is more here than meets the eye. And I suspect the rose and the symbol may yet prove more telling than the man himself. For a moment, Holmes stood in silence, his gaze fixed upon the dying embers in the grate. Then he turned to Vernet with a sudden decisiveness. You were right to come to me, he said. This case possesses several singular features that elevate it above the common ruck. He reached for his pipe and struck a match. We shall call upon Monsieur Drouet's lodgings at first light. Watson, you will accompany me. I suspect that the night's fog has not only veiled the city, but also the truth behind a most curious vanishing. And with that, the game was once again afoot. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Holmes and I found ourselves standing before the residence at Eaton Place, a tall, austere townhouse whose unremarkable exterior belied the peculiarities within. We were met by the valet, who, though clearly shaken, maintained the composure of long service. Holmes, with that familiar air of quiet authority, requested to be shown at once to the study where the disappearance had occurred. The room, though tastefully appointed, bore no immediate signs of disruption. The furnishings remained in place, the Persian rug unruffled, and the coal grate still contained the pale remnants of the last fire. Holmes moved at once to the door, examining the lock, handle, and hinges with keen scrutiny. "This was forced open, you say?" "Yes, sir," the valet replied, "after Monsieur failed to answer, and we feared some accident. Yet no damage beyond the latch. Curious," Holmes murmured. He crossed to the windows, each of which was shuttered and latched from within. No broken panes, no tampering of the sashes, and the drop to the street is sheer. 20 feet, I should say. Certainly not an escape route without detection. He knelt beside the writing desk, examining the surface with a magnifying lens. No signs of a struggle, no spilled ink, no hasty departure. What time did the maid deliver his supper? "Around 8:30, sir. She left it at the door as instructed." Holmes nodded absently. "And when last was Monsieur seen?" "Just before he entered the room. I helped him off with his coat. He seemed preoccupied." Holmes stood, folding his hands behind his back. "We are presented, Watson, with a room locked from within, a man who vanished without trace, and no witness to any act. Either the laws of nature have been suspended, or someone has taken considerable pains to suggest as much." He turned slowly, his eyes moving once more across the quiet chamber. "Let us look more closely. Such puzzles often lie not in what is present, but in what is ever so slightly out of place." Holmes's gaze had shifted to the mantel above the fireplace, where his eyes now rested upon a faint, charred outline in the wood panelling. He reached into his coat and produced a small pocket lens, which he used to examine the mark with forensic precision. "Not the result of a natural fire," he murmured. "This scorch was made deliberately, likely with a heated iron or branding tool. Note the symmetry, an eye within a triangle, radiating lines like the rays of a sun. It is no idle doodle." I peered over his shoulder. "It has an unsettling look. What could it mean?" "A symbol, Watson, but not a common one. This design appears in the esoteric literature of certain secret societies, organizations with roots in alchemy and mysticism. That it should appear here is no triviality." He moved to the hearth and bent to pick up a curled fragment from the floor. It was a petal, blackened at its edges. "A rose," he said softly, "but not of English stock. The texture is delicate, too delicate for our climate. And the colour, this deep crimson tinged with violet, speaks of Provence. It is a rare hybrid. I have only seen its like once before, in the collection of a certain horticulturist in Marseille." "You think it was carried here deliberately?" "Without doubt. No man carries a rose of such peculiarity by accident. And to leave it here, by the hearth, either carelessly or as a mark." Holmes straightened and dusted his hands. "Between this sigil and this petal, we have a message, veiled but not unintelligible. This is no crime of impulse, Watson. It bears the signature of intention and of ritual." "But to what end?" I asked. "That," he said, "is what we must uncover." Holmes turned his attention next to the French windows leading onto the narrow balcony at the rear of the room. Though securely latched, he requested they be opened, and the valet obliged. Stepping out, he surveyed the stone floor with a keen eye. Almost at once he dropped to one knee. "Here," he said. "A partial smear, along the edge of the threshold." I leaned closer. "It appears to be dirt." "Not dirt, Watson. Clay, red clay. Note its hue and fine grain. This is not of London's soil." He scraped up a portion with a penknife and deposited it into a glass vial he had drawn from his coat. "This composition is foreign. It lacks the gravelly admixture we find in our city parks. It is more in keeping with the subsoils of the continent, or perhaps of certain subterranean deposits known to run beneath parts of Westminster." "You suggest someone entered or exited through here?" Suggest? Number I assert it. The clay indicates movement from a source below, not from above or beyond. Someone used this route. Not through the front door, not through the window in any conventional sense, but by means of a passage unknown to this household. But the door was latched. Precisely, which implies the mechanism was engaged after the act, a misdirection. Holmes stood once more and looked into the room with renewed interest. This was not a locked room mystery, it was made to appear one. As Holmes concluded his scrutiny of the balcony, he turned to the valet with a quiet authority that seldom failed to loosen tongues. "You said Monsieur Drouet was preoccupied?" he asked. The valet hesitated, folding his hands. "Indeed, sir. For several days prior to his disappearance, he seemed nervous, distracted. I found him more than once pacing in his study, muttering in French. I dared not ask the reason." "Did he receive visitors?" "Only one that I saw, sir. The day before he vanished. A strange gentleman who came unannounced and stayed scarcely 20 minutes. Monsieur met with him alone." "Describe him," Holmes said, sharply now. The valet's brow furrowed. He was pale, exceedingly so, with dark hair and eyes that did not match. One blue, one grey. A disconcerting face, I must say. I had the impression of something theatrical, perhaps foreign. Holmes made no reply, but noted something in his book. "Did Monsieur Drouet mention this visitor afterward?" "No, sir, but that evening he double-locked the study and insisted on absolute privacy. That was most unlike him." "Thank you. You have been exceedingly helpful." As we turned to leave, I saw a curious gleam in Holmes's eye. "Well, Watson," he murmured as we stepped into the corridor, "we are beginning to acquire colour. A pale man with mismatched eyes is rarely met with in mundane affairs. Such eccentricities of nature often coincide with eccentricities of purpose." We found the housemaid in the servants' hall, a shy girl with a timid voice and large, watchful eyes. Holmes treated her with an uncommon gentleness. "You heard something the night Monsieur Drouet disappeared?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied, twisting her apron. "It were past 11. I was in my room, just above the study. I heard a sound." "Music, sir." "Music," Holmes echoed. "A tune, soft and low, like it was drifting through the walls. Not from a gramophone. No, it were played by hand. A piano, or maybe a harmonium. Very slow, very strange." "Could you make it out?" She shook her head. "It didn't sound like any song I knew. There were a sort of pattern to it, but not a melody I could follow. It was—" She faltered, then said, "It were haunting." "Was Monsieur known to play any instrument?" "No, sir. He had no music in the house." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did anyone else hear it?" "I asked cook the next morning, but she said she'd heard nothing." Holmes nodded and thanked her. As we walked away, I ventured, "Surely a musician in the street." "A coincidence?" He shook his head. "No, Watson. This case becomes less of a vanishing and more of a performance." "A performance? There are harmonies even in silence," he said cryptically. "One must simply learn to listen." Later that afternoon, Holmes made a discreet inquiry at the Foreign Office. It was there that the name Sir Malcolm Whitehall first arose, a man with a reputation for being both distinguished and difficult. He and Drouet were known to cross swords, our informant said. Nothing official, of course, but sharp words behind closed doors, policy disagreements, rival ambitions. Back at Baker Street, Holmes shared what he had gleaned. "Whitehall," he said, lighting a fresh pipe, "has long harboured suspicions about the French approach to naval expansion. He and Drouet had several documented disagreements at diplomatic luncheons and receptions. Are you suggesting he might be involved? I asked. Holmes raised an eyebrow. I suggest nothing as yet, but we must not be blind to the possibility of a motive. If someone wished to delay or sabotage the Anglo-French alliance, eliminating Drouet would be a calculated move. But murder, Holmes, surely that is an extraordinary leap. Indeed, he replied, which is why we must tread cautiously. It is easy to ascribe sinister intent to those who merely disagree. Yet it is the very ease of that path that makes it dangerous. I reflected on this as Holmes fell into his usual silence. The image of the pale man, the strange melody, and now a possible diplomatic rivalry. It was a triangle of intrigue, but one whose sides remained unconnected. That evening, I found Holmes once more in his armchair, his fingers steepled, eyes half closed in contemplation. The case, which had grown steadily stranger, seemed to have pulled him into its very depths. "Watson," he said at last, "what is music?" I looked up, startled. "Music? Why, sound arranged by time and pitch, I suppose." "Exactly. A system, a structure of vibration. But it is also a language, is it not? One that may conceal as easily as it reveals. You refer to the maid's account?" "I do. That melody she described, haunting, patternless, unfamiliar. To her it was merely unsettling, but to the right ears it may have been a message." "You believe it was a signal?" Holmes nodded. "I believe Drouet's disappearance was neither abrupt nor impulsive. It was orchestrated, like a composition. We have a locked room, symbolic markings, an exotic rose, and now a tune with no origin." He rose and paced. "We must consider not merely who benefits from Drouet's removal, but who possesses the means to achieve it through performance, illusion, and precision. This is not a blunt crime. It is, I suspect, an artful one." "And Sir Malcolm?" "He is a footnote, useful to mislead, but ultimately unimportant." I leaned forward. "Then where does this lead?" He turned, a strange gleam in his eye. "To the theatre, Watson. Not the stage of comedy and farce, but the darker stage, where shadows dance and music speaks in cipher." It was 2 days after our visit to Eaton Place that a fresh lead arrived by way of Inspector Lestrade. Though Holmes often regarded the Yard with a mixture of amusement and disdain, he admitted that even a blunt tool might occasionally strike true. "There's been a sighting," Lestrade informed us, adjusting his coat with a briskness born more of pride than purpose. "A gentleman answering Drouet's description was seen last evening at the Criterion Theatre. A French accent. Same building slipped out during the second act." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Curious. Drouet was last seen vanishing from a locked room, and now he walks freely among the stalls of the West End. We've an officer posted near the theatre. Come quickly if you wish to see for yourself." Holmes glanced at me, his eyes brightening. "Come, Watson, the game takes on a theatrical hue." Upon arriving, we were ushered through the theatre's side entrance and into the wings. A performance was still underway, a French farce by the looks of the bill, but Lestrade led us backstage to a dressing room recently vacated. There, a costumer identified the man in question. "Oh yes," she said, "that's Monsieur Duval. He's in the chorus. Just joined last week. French accent and all." Moments later, Duval himself appeared, thin, dark-haired, and, it must be said, strikingly similar to the missing diplomat. Holmes spoke with him in fluent French for a few minutes, then stepped aside, the brief glint of expectation gone from his face. "Merely a resemblance," he said, "a most convincing one to be sure. But Duval is precisely who he claims to be. An actor, and not a very good one, I fear." So another dead end? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Not dead, merely misdirected. The appearance of Drouet in such a setting may yet prove to be more than coincidence. No sooner had we returned to Baker Street than another diversion arrived. This time by post. The letter was hand-delivered and bore no return address. The paper was cheap, the script angular and unfamiliar. Holmes slit it open and read in silence. Well, I asked. He passed it to me. It was brief and incendiary. To the agents of British tyranny, Drouet is no more. The cause of liberty is served. Let his fate be a warning to all who conspire against the revolution. La Ligue de l'Ombre. I looked up. The League of Shadow? A French anarchist group. A name of menace, certainly, Holmes replied, but empty in this case. You're certain? Consider, Watson. The style is too theatrical. The vocabulary lacks the subtlety of true radicals. And the name, La Ligue de l'Ombre, is not found in any of the police intelligence reports I reviewed last year. You mean to say it's a fabrication? Indeed, a red herring. Someone seeks to draw attention toward political extremism, perhaps to conceal something more calculated. He held the letter to the flame and watched it curl into ash. You burn it. It serves no purpose but to distract. Just then, a knock at the door revealed Lestrade once more, this time with news that the embassy had received an identical letter. He seemed unsettled when Holmes greeted the development with little more than a nod. You're not concerned, Mr. Holmes. I am concerned with reality, Lestrade. This letter is theatre, like the actor at the Criterion. But someone is writing the script. We must find the dramatist. And as the door closed once more, Holmes's gaze turned not to the streets, but to the shadows beyond them. Later that evening, Holmes summoned me from my reading with a quiet remark. I have traced the rose, Watson. I looked up. The one from Drouet's study? Yes, it is a hybrid exclusive to southern France, very rare, cultivated only by select hands. One such hand now resides in London, or more precisely, beneath it. His tone carried that peculiar energy I had come to associate with imminent revelation. There is a private club in Soho, La Rose Noire, a name which should strike you as more than coincidence. It is known to a very small circle, primarily French exiles, the sort of men who wear silk gloves by day and traffic in shadows by night. And you believe Drouet was a member? Not a member, an observer. He visited frequently over the past month. Quietly, discreetly, never with embassy escort. And how did you discover this? Holmes gave one of his enigmatic smiles. The doorman at the Marlborough Hotel has an eye for detail and a weakness for fine tobacco. That night we visited the district in question. Though Holmes had changed into attire more suited to discretion, he carried himself with the easy air of one familiar with even the most esoteric corners of London society. What we found at La Rose Noire was a dimly lit cellar of velvet and smoke, filled with whispers in French, the low murmur of piano music, and the scent of rare perfumes. Holmes said little, but his eyes missed nothing. He lingered near the pianist, a thin man with sharp cheekbones and one eye noticeably darker than the other. You see him, Watson, Holmes whispered. The mismatched eyes, I said. The valet's description. Holmes nodded. Alain Dupré, a musician by profession, a shadow by nature. And though we left that evening without confrontation, I could sense in Holmes a gathering storm. Holmes had remained near the back of the club, eyes fixed not upon the guests, but on the man seated at the piano. A gaunt figure in a black coat, his fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys in a composition that was both hypnotic and disquieting. That, Holmes whispered, Is the man? I leaned forward. You're certain? Beyond question. The mismatched eyes, one grey, the other an unusually pale blue, mark him as the visitor the valet described. But it is not merely his appearance that interests me. We listened as the melody unfolded, a slow, repetitive series of tones that dance between major and minor with deliberate asymmetry. Though I had no musical training, there was something unnerving in its rhythm, as though it hinted at a structure beneath the surface I could not quite grasp. He is not simply playing, Holmes murmured. He is communicating. With whom? That, he said, we must determine. But I believe the key to Drouet's disappearance lies as much in this man's hands as in his eyes. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused once more near the edge of the stage. Dupre did not look up, but there was a moment, a flicker, where I felt the pianist knew he was being observed. Outside, Holmes spoke only once before we departed. A man who can compose a riddle in sound, he said, is a man who understands how to be heard without ever being seen. We returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes remained pensive, his hands tented beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling as if the answer might materialize there in smoke and shadow. You recall the maid's testimony? He asked abruptly. Of the music? Yes, she heard it the night Drouet vanished. Precisely. And tonight we heard its echo. That same motif, Watson, buried in Dupre's performance, subtle enough to escape notice, yet constant in its reappearance. You believe it is a signal. Not merely a signal, a cipher. Consider this. If a man cannot risk words or ink, he may instead encode meaning through notes. Music, like language, follows structure. If one knows the key, both musically and metaphorically, one may decode a message hidden in plain sound. I stared at him. You're suggesting Dupre used music to transmit instructions? Perhaps, or coordinates, or warnings, but I am now convinced that this case is not a simple disappearance. It is part of something deeper, ritualistic, structured, and rooted in performance. He rose and retrieved a slim volume from the shelf. The Secret Harmonies of the Occident, he explained. A curious little treatise on ancient musical codes and their use in private societies. He opened it to a marked page, revealing diagrams of scales arranged in triangles and circles, with symbols hauntingly similar to the scorched sigil on Drouet's wall. It all begins to coalesce. The rose, the sigil, the clay, the melody. They are not disparate curiosities. They are fragments of a singular composition. You truly believe a secret order is involved? Holmes gave a rare smile. I believe someone is composing more than music, Watson. They are composing fate. And Drouet was caught between the bars. It was the following morning when Holmes, after dispatching a pair of telegrams and pacing our sitting room for the better part of an hour, turned to me with that cold precision I had come to associate with his most dangerous conclusions. Drouet was not merely a diplomat, he began. He was, in effect, a watcher, a quiet sentinel placed within the embassy to monitor certain activities deemed ambiguous. Ambiguous? I asked. Suspect, Watson. There have been whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, of leaks from the embassy, naval positions, treaty drafts. Even personnel movements have surfaced in places they ought never have reached. The French ministry, alarmed, sent Drouet not just as envoy, but as investigator. And you believe he discovered something? I believe he uncovered a line of communication stretching not only to foreign agents, but through channels so discreet they could never be traced through parchment or post. Thus, music. Holmes nodded gravely. Dupre's presence at La Rose Noire is no coincidence. He is not simply a pianist, but a courier of the intangible. Drouet, I suspect, identified him and was preparing to expose the network. And that, Watson, is why he vanished. Then someone inside the embassy betrayed him. Indeed, someone with access and with enough influence to delay official inquiry. Vernet's panic was real, but others at the embassy may be less dismayed. Holmes paused, then added, "It is not enough to find Drouet. We must draw out the architect behind his disappearance, and we must do so quickly, for every day that passes increases the chance that Drouet's silence becomes permanent." He turned to the window, eyes narrowing at the rain beyond the glass. "This is no longer a mystery of a man who vanished. It is a matter of espionage, deception, and the most subtle of poisons, trust betrayed." It was 3 days later that Holmes, having conferred discreetly with certain contacts in both the Home Office and the French Embassy, informed me that the stage was set. "We shall host a concert, Watson," he said, with a trace of amusement. "A concert?" I echoed, unsure whether he spoke metaphorically or in earnest. "Yes, a private affair. Ostensibly a gesture of goodwill between our two nations, but in truth a carefully designed snare. I have arranged for La Rose Noire to open its doors for one evening only to select diplomats, artists, and officials. Alain Dupré shall be the centerpiece. And what of Drouet? If he is still alive, I believe we shall find him before the evening is done. But the key lies not in questioning our suspect. It lies in allowing him to perform." That evening, we arrived in formal attire. The velvet-draped interior of the club had been transformed into a salon of civility, replete with candlelight and muted conversation. Yet beneath the genteel murmurings, I could feel the tension that coursed like a live wire through every movement Holmes made. Dupré took the stage with characteristic composure, bowing slightly before beginning his set. The first selections were delicate, impressionistic, Debussy and Fauré, rendered with an artistry I could not help but admire. But Holmes was unmoved. He sat rigid, his eyes closed, not with relaxation, but with focus. He was not listening for beauty. He was listening for structure. At last, Holmes leaned in and whispered, "The piece is next." "What piece?" "The one he used the night Drouet vanished. Listen closely, Watson, not to the music itself, but to its silences." I did as he instructed, and as the next tune began, slow and dissonant, something in the air changed. I could not name it, but Holmes knew. He had found his signal. The composition Dupré now played bore no title and no recognizable origin, but its effect was immediate. A hush fell over the gathering, not of awe, but of uncertainty. There was something in the piece that resisted interpretation, as though the notes themselves spoke in a language long since lost to civilized ears. Holmes, meanwhile, had risen from his chair. With a wordless glance to me, he began to move casually through the room, as though stretching his legs. But I knew better. He was tracing a pattern, a circuit he had mapped out in his mind days earlier. At a discreet moment between movements, Holmes approached the side of the stage and, feigning admiration for the craftsmanship of a column, let his hand brush along a strip of decorative panelling. His fingers paused. Then, with the barest pressure, he depressed a section that gave way beneath his touch. I rose at once, but he signalled me to remain still. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a folded paper, one of the diagrams from the esoteric music treatise he had consulted. He compared it to a subtle sequence Dupré had just played. "The cadence mirrors the cipher," he muttered under his breath. At the precise moment that Dupré struck the final dissonant chord, Holmes returned to the wall. With a deft motion, he pressed the same panel again. Only this time, it opened, revealing a sliver of blackness beyond. No one else had noticed. The room remained wrapped in the haunting afterglow of the music, polite applause breaking out amongst those still unsure whether what they had heard was genius or madness. Holmes caught my eye and nodded. It was time. Together we slipped behind the false panel and descended a narrow stair concealed in the wall. Each step downward was met with growing tension, the air stale and laced with the scent of damp stone. And then, at the bottom, we found the passage, long, unlit, and winding. "This, Watson," Holmes whispered, "is where the vanished go." We followed the passage in silence, Holmes leading with unerring instinct. The air was thick and stale, the darkness near total save for the faint glow of Holmes's pocket lantern, which cast jagged shadows along the narrow brick corridor. At length, the tunnel opened into a low-ceilinged cellar lined with wine racks, long since emptied, and a rusted table at its centre. Upon it lay a form. "Drouet," Holmes said softly. I hurried forward. The man was unconscious but breathing, his coat still bearing the embassy's insignia, though torn and dust-streaked. A faint pulse beat at his throat. His eyes fluttered as I touched his wrist. "Drugged," I murmured. Holmes examined the surroundings. They kept him here to extract what they needed, and planned to dispose of him once the information was taken, perhaps through Dupre's methods, or by more final means. He gestured toward a small phonograph in the corner, silent now, but with a roll already prepared. They intended to finish the message, Holmes said. To deliver something before dawn, Drouet was to be the silence between the notes. With effort we roused him. He was confused, muttering fragments of both English and French, but upon seeing Holmes, recognition returned. "You must stop him," he whispered hoarsely. "It's not just France. Others involved." "We will," Holmes assured him, gripping his shoulder firmly. At that moment, a sound echoed above us, the scraping of a chair, the faint thud of movement. "They've realized," Holmes said. "Quickly, Watson. We must bring him out before the curtain falls." We had scarcely brought Drouet back through the hidden stairway when Holmes motioned for Lestrade, who had been seated in the rear of the gathering on Holmes's quiet instruction. The inspector stepped forward with a number of plainclothes constables, while the music room, still heavy with the echo of Dupre's performance, fell into confused murmuring. Holmes advanced calmly to the stage, where Dupre had just risen from the piano, bowing with the poised detachment of a seasoned performer. The applause, uncertain and perfunctory, dwindled as Holmes raised a hand. "Monsieur Dupre," he said clearly, "your final piece was masterfully executed, but like all well-constructed illusions, it relies upon silence to conceal its true form." Dupre stiffened. "I do not understand." "No?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I should clarify. Your performance tonight included a ciphered message, echoing the same musical phrase heard on the night of Jean-Baptiste Drouet's disappearance, a message intended for those who know the key." The pianist's expression did not change, but there was a minute tightening around the jaw. Holmes continued. "Behind that wall," he gestured to the hidden panel, "is a passage leading to a chamber where Monsieur Drouet was held. We have just removed him from it, alive, though heavily sedated." A gasp spread through the room. Dupre made a half-step backward, but Lestrade stepped in beside the stage. "You played the role of a simple artist," Holmes went on, "but you served another master, one with interest in disrupting diplomatic affairs through subtle manipulation. Music, Monsieur Dupre, became your medium. But your composition was flawed in one respect. It failed to anticipate a listener who understood the silences between the notes. Still, the man said nothing. Holmes's voice lowered. We know of the Cipher Society. We have the encoded sheets. And we have the witness who saw you enter Drouet's chambers that night. At last, Dupré spoke, his voice hollow. Then it is finished. Holmes gave a single nod. The overture ends. The truth, I'm afraid, always plays the final note. It was in the momentary confusion following Holmes's declaration that Dupré acted. With a swiftness that surprised even Lestrade, he leapt from the stage, overturned a chair, and darted through the side corridor, vanishing into the narrow alley behind La Rose Noire. Holmes and I were immediately in pursuit. The fog had returned with thick insistence, muffling our footfalls and swallowing Dupré's silhouette as he darted through the night like a shadow in flight. Left, Holmes cried, turning into a passage I had not seen. We emerged into a courtyard, and there, frozen mid-step, stood Dupré, facing a tall wrought-iron gate. Beyond it, Lestrade stepped into view with 2 constables, revolver drawn. There's no further to go, monsieur, Holmes said gently. The performance is over. Dupré turned, his face a mask of resignation, and lowered his hands. And just like that, the spell broke. As Lestrade moved to restrain him, I could not help but feel a strange melancholy, as though the very fog mourned the fall of a man who had played his part too well, and for the wrong cause. Holmes said nothing until we reached Baker Street once more. Then, lighting his pipe, he murmured, "There is no silence more profound than that which follows the final bar." The following morning found Holmes, as ever, calm and precise, seated opposite me in our Baker Street sitting room, his long fingers steepled and his gaze distant, yet focused. Drouet had been placed under careful medical supervision and was expected to recover in full, though Holmes had expressed little surprise at the diplomat's resilience. "You recall the rose petal, Watson?" he asked suddenly, as though continuing a conversation we had not begun. "Indeed, the one scorched upon the hearthrug of Drouet's study." "Quite so. A curious specimen. It was neither native to England nor typical of any florist one might find in Belgravia. Its hue, a deep violet red, identified it as Rosa Gallica var. Sancta Lucia, a hybrid cultivated only in select gardens in Provence." "And how did that tie us to La Rose Noire?" "By its exclusivity," Holmes replied. "Only 3 imports of that particular strain were registered in the past 6 months. 2 to private collectors, and 1, under a false name, to a Monsieur Leblanc, who, as we have now confirmed, is none other than Alain Dupré." I nodded slowly. "So he left the petal as a mark." "Or a message," Holmes said. "An emblem known only to those initiated. Dupré did not act alone. He operated within a ring, an order of men who employ the trappings of art and mysticism as a veil for espionage. That rose was not an accident. It was a calling card. And yet it nearly misled us entirely, only because we were meant to see it as decorative. But you will note, Watson, that every element left behind in Drouet's chamber was carefully curated, chosen not for evidence, but for ambiguity." I considered this, then asked, "And the rose's scent?" "It was laced with something exotic." "Absinthe oil," Holmes confirmed. Another calculated detail. It cloaked the room in the aura of vice and illusion, preparing us for a mystery of sensation rather than deduction. He paused, then added, "But, as ever, the truth blooms only in those gardens well tended by reason." "It was no coincidence, Watson," Holmes continued, "that the club bore the name La Rose Noire. That symbol and the atmosphere cultivated within its walls was as much a construct as Dupray's melody. He rose from his chair and took up the scorched sketch of the sigil retrieved from Drouet's chamber. "You recall the scent of absinthe," he said. Its presence was not merely a decadent flourish. In ritual contexts, particularly among esoteric circles, absinthe is said to dilate the senses, to unlock what lies beyond perception. Dupray, and those with him, used it not as intoxicant, but as invocation. I shook my head. "You speak of this place as if it were a temple." In a sense it was, but not of faith. La Rose Noire was a shrine to secrecy. The music, the lighting, even the patrons, they were all part of a performance designed to attract those already dancing on the edge of politics and occultism. Those whose loyalties were shifting, their motives obscured. He moved to the mantel and placed the sigil sketch beside his violin. "This mark," he said, tapping it gently, "is derived from a variation of the Rosicrucian symbol, adapted to conceal directional glyphs. In Dupray's hands, it became part of a cipher system that extended into the club structure itself." "You mean the very architecture?" "Precisely. The hidden stairway, the acoustics, even the sequence of rooms, all contributed to an environment in which silence could be as informative as speech. It was a theatre of codes." Holmes returned to his seat. "Dupray played more than music. He played belief, Watson. He cloaked information in mystery, betting that those bound by logic would dismiss the symbols as eccentricity." He gave a rare smile. "But eccentricity, when repeated with precision, is never random. It is design. It is the mark upon the wall," Holmes went on, "that delivered the final note of clarity." He unrolled a sheet from his file, a charcoal rubbing of the scorched symbol found in Drouet's chamber, and placed it side by side with a diagram from the music treatise he had consulted during the investigation. "To the uninitiated, this may resemble an alchemical flourish. But look closely. See how the triangle is rotated 30 degrees from true. The rays are unevenly spaced. This is no ornament. It is a cipher." I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. "Each element corresponds," Holmes said, "to a tone, and each tone, when arranged in proper sequence, mirrors the opening bars of the melody Dupray employed. In short, it was a visual transcription of the same message transmitted through sound." "You mean the symbol and the music said the same thing?" "Exactly. The symbol instructed where the melody must be played, and in what space. The scorched mark aligned with the resonance point of Drouet's study. It was both a signal and a trigger." "For what?" "For entry," Holmes replied. "A concealed mechanism within the wall, activated by vibration at a precise frequency. That is how Dupray accessed the chamber from below, without force, without noise, the perfect illusion of a locked room." I stared at the rubbing in quiet wonder. "And the red clay?" "Deposited by his boots as he ascended through the passage, a rare mineral found only beneath the Thames embankments and used in the reconstruction of certain wine cellars, one of which lies directly beneath La Rose Noire." Holmes gathered the papers and returned them to his folio. Thus, every element, symbol, scent, sound, and soil fit together as pieces of a singular, deliberate scheme. What appeared random was, in truth, a masterpiece of concealment. He drew in a breath and exhaled slowly. "Such criminals do not rely on shadows, Watson. They create them." Holmes stood by the hearth, the final fragments of the case arrayed like chessmen across the table, petal, sigil, cipher, and clay. His tone was calm, but beneath it I sensed a quiet satisfaction, as one might observe in a surgeon who has removed a malignant growth with absolute precision. "You will recall, Watson," he said, "that the most mundane detail often proves the most telling. The red clay, for instance. Yes, I replied. You remarked upon its presence upon the balcony, though there was no garden. Precisely. That clay, silted, mineral-rich, and subtly red in hue, matches a rare subterranean deposit found in but a few places beneath the city. Chief among them, the disused wine cellars once belonging to the French trading companies of the early 18th century. Many have been sealed or forgotten. One, however, lies directly beneath La Rose Noire. And you believe Dupré used that route? I know he did. The trail of clay we recovered from the sole of Drouet's boot was the same, Watson, tracked from cellar to balcony. It reveals the means by which he entered a locked room without disturbing lock or window. But the room was latched from the inside. Holmes gave a faint smile. Not at all. It was latched by Dupré as he left, from within, and then exited through the passage. A simple drawer latch can be affixed and closed from behind with a length of wire or looped thread. He tapped his fingers together. It is not magic that creates the illusion of impossibility, Watson. It is misdirection, methodically employed. So the mystery of the locked room, solved by a tunnel. Indeed. Not glamorous, but elegant in its own fashion. And so the diplomat vanished, not by force, but by design. In the days that followed, the story slipped from the headlines, replaced by the next scandal or political tremor. Official reports noted that Monsieur Drouet had suffered an illness brought on by fatigue and stress. The word kidnapping was avoided entirely. No mention was made of the club, the cipher, or the man with mismatched eyes who played messages into the walls of London's underworld. But I could not let it go so lightly. One evening, as Holmes sat absorbed once again in his violin, I found myself revisiting the cascade of events that had begun with a burnt petal and ended in a secret cellar beneath Soho. You knew from the beginning, didn't you? I asked. He lowered the instrument, but did not look up. I knew nothing, Watson. I observed, I gathered data, and I allowed the facts to speak. But the rose, the scent, the sigil, it all seemed too theatrical. Exactly so. When a thing appears contrived, it must be examined not as clumsy but as intentional. Dupré did not wish to conceal Drouet. He wished to obscure the manner of his vanishing. A puzzle posed not to defy logic, but to mislead it. And yet you never lost your way. He gave a soft laugh. On the contrary, I stumbled more than once. I pursued the actor at the theatre. I briefly entertained the anarchist letter. But each mistake trimmed the branches. What remained was the root. I stared into the fire for some time before speaking again. There was something almost spiritual about the way it unfolded. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, every case contains two truths, Watson. The one we solve and the one we carry. The world may never know what nearly occurred behind that club's velvet curtains, but we shall. And Dupré will be dealt with in quiet corridors and closed courts. Men like him do not die in scandal. They vanish into silence. I nodded, though a part of me resented the thought. I wanted justice to shine in daylight, not fade into obscurity. But I understood at last what Holmes had meant. There are truths too dangerous for applause. The evening after Dupré's arrest, I returned once more to Baker Street. The air outside was heavy with rain, the city cloaked in a greyness that seemed to soak through even one's thoughts. Inside, the lamps were low and the room quiet, save for the low hum of Holmes's violin, a slow, contemplative piece, unrecognizable to my ear. He played for some time before setting the instrument aside and fixing me with a glance of peculiar gravity. "There is something I wish you to understand, Watson," he said. I folded my hands. "Yes?" This case, more than most, reminded me of a dangerous truth, that the most potent weapons in this world are not guns or blades, but silence when wielded by the right mind. I said nothing. "Dupre was clever," Holmes went on. "Not because he escaped notice, but because he understood attention. He engineered a spectacle to distract, mislead, and lull. He understood human nature and used its assumptions as his cloak." I considered this in silence. "Most crimes," Holmes said softly, "are committed in haste. But the rarest, the most elegant, are composed, like music, slowly, rehearsed, scored for an audience of none. And we were fortunate to hear it." He smiled faintly. "Or cursed." A log cracked in the hearth. He reached once more for his violin, drawing the bow slowly across the strings. This time the tune was familiar, melancholy, but pure. It filled the room like mist, softening the edges of things. Outside, the city stirred with its usual indifference. Men hurried past one another, unaware that a war of secrets had been waged and won in the very heart of their civilization. And within that warm chamber, my friend, my brilliant, difficult, singular friend, closed his eyes and played on as though coaxing silence itself to speak. Of all the cases I was privileged to witness, the puzzle of the missing French diplomat stands among those I revisit most in thought. Not for its villain, nor even its solution, but for the simple truth Holmes had uttered that night. The most dangerous instruments, my dear Watson, are not daggers or pistols, but the minds that wield silence as a weapon. As the soft strains of Holmes's violin faded into the lamplight, I found myself watching him in contemplative silence. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, but his expression was serene, almost distant. "You astonish me still, Holmes," I said at length. "To trace a vanishing man by a petal, a melody, and a mark upon the wall. It was nothing short of alchemy." He smiled faintly, setting the violin aside. "Not alchemy, Watson. Structure. A criminal, no matter how cunning, cannot help but leave behind the shape of their thinking. The melody, the sigil, the rose. Each was not merely a clue, but a note in a composition they believed only they could hear. My task was merely to listen for its echo." He paused, then added more quietly, "But the most dangerous compositions are not those played aloud. They are those composed in silence." Holmes turned back to the window, the London fog curling softly against the pane. "Tell me, Watson," he mused, "what do you believe was Dupre's gravest miscalculation? Was it underestimating the power of sound, or overestimating the secrecy of silence? And what about you, dear reader? What do you think was the criminal's biggest mistake? Was it the cipher, the clay, or the music that betrayed its own composer? We'd love to hear your deductions in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, be sure to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes adventures and share this tale with fellow lovers of deduction and deception. Until next time, stay curious, keep observing, and never underestimate the silence between the notes.